The air at forward operating base Serenity was thin and sharp, a blade of ice in the lungs. It was a temporary stain of canvas and steel perched at 14,000 feet in the Serac Peaks, a place where the wind had a voice and the silence had weight. Warrant Officer Anya Sharma felt it the moment she stepped off the C-130 transport, a pressure behind the eyes that had nothing to do with altitude. It was the pressure of scrutiny. She was a small woman, wiry and compact, with threads of silver at her temples that belied the sharp, steady focus in her dark eyes. She moved with an economy of motion, her worn flight bag slung over one shoulder, her steps sure on the gravel-dusted permafrost. The base commander, Major Kalen Thorne, met her near the operations tent. He was a tall man, built like a battering ram, with a jaw that seemed permanently clenched against the cold and the inefficiency of others. His eyes swept over her, taking in her slight frame and the faded, almost archaic flight suit. His gaze lingered for a second on the unadorned patch where a unit insignia should be. It was just blank, olive-drab fabric. "Warrant Officer Sharma," he said, the words clipped, devoid of warmth. "You're the replacement pilot for the transport wing." It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." Her voice was low, calm, carrying no more inflection than necessary. Thorne grunted. "Your bird is the UH-60 on Pad 3. The Spectre, they're calling it. Looks like it was pulled out of a museum." He gestured with his chin toward a Black Hawk helicopter that sat apart from the newer, sleeker models. Its paint was faded, its lines classic but visibly modified. Extra antennae bristled from its spine, and the engine cowlings had a reinforced, custom look. A young, barrel-chested sergeant named Reyes, Thorne's ever-present shadow, snorted softly. "Heard she's a hangar queen, sir. More time on the ground than in the air." Sharma said nothing. She walked past them toward the helicopter, her focus already on the machine. She didn't look at the other pilots who watched from the warmth of the mess tent, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and dismissal. She was an anomaly, an older pilot, a woman in a high-altitude combat zone, assigned to a bird that looked like a relic. She ran a gloved hand along the fuselage of the Spectre, feeling the cold, familiar texture of the metal. The rivets were solid, the skin unblemished by corrosion. She knew this machine. She knew every wire, every hydraulic line, every idiosyncratic groan of its transmission. It was not a museum piece. It was an instrument, honed and perfected for a very specific purpose. Later, in the briefing tent, the atmosphere was thick with masculine confidence and the smell of stale coffee. Thorne stood before a large tactical map of the surrounding peaks, outlining a multi-day reconnaissance mission for a Special Forces team, call sign Viper 3. They were to be inserted deep into a contested valley to observe enemy movement. "Air support will be handled by Raptor flight for close air, and our standard SAR birds are on hot standby," Thorne explained, his pointer tapping a designated landing zone. He glanced at Sharma, who sat in the back, observing. "Warrant Officer Sharma, your role is logistical. You'll be running supplies to the lower staging area at FOB Dagger. Nothing complex. Stay below 10,000 feet. Stick to the designated corridors. The weather here is unforgiving and turns without warning. We don't need any hot-shot maneuvers." The implication was clear. She was a bus driver, and a potentially unreliable one at that. Sergeant Reyes, leaning against a support pole, smirked openly. Sharma's gaze was fixed on the map. She noted the insertion point, the surrounding topography, and the meteorological overlays flickering on a side monitor. "Major," she said, her voice cutting cleanly through the low murmur. "The isobaric charts show a potential for a significant pressure drop over the Gorgon's Tooth Massif in the next 48 hours. If that front accelerates, it could generate katabatic winds in excess of 80 knots through that valley." The tent went quiet. All eyes turned to her. Thorne's face hardened. He was a ground pounder, a man who understood terrain and tactics, but the finer points of mountain meteorology were the domain of his specialists, who had already cleared the mission. "Your concern is noted, Warrant Officer," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. But our weather techs have assured us the window is clear. Your job is to fly supplies from point A to point B. Let us handle the operational planning. Reyes chimed in, unable to resist. Yeah, warrant officer. We need beans and bullets, not a weather report. A few of the younger soldiers chuckled. Sharma didn't react. She simply held the major's gaze for a moment longer, her own expression unreadable, before giving a slight, almost imperceptible nod. She had made her point. It had been dismissed. There was nothing more to say. She remained silent for the rest of the briefing, a still point in a room of restless energy. As they filed out, she heard Reyes mutter to another NCO, "Where'd they even find her?" Bet she flew a desk for 20 years. She kept walking, her focus already turning back to her machine, the Spectre, waiting silently on its pad under the immense, indifferent sky. The next 36 hours were a study in routine. Sharma flew her designated cargo runs, her movements precise and efficient. She ferried crates of MREs, ammunition, and medical supplies to the lower altitude base, her flights smooth and unremarkable. The Spectre performed flawlessly, its engines humming a familiar, powerful tune. Between flights, she performed her own maintenance, working alongside the ground crew, who were initially wary of her. They watched as she personally inspected the de-icing boots on the rotor blades, checked the integrity of the hydraulic fluid lines, and ran diagnostics on the advanced avionics suite that seemed strangely out of place in such an old airframe. Her quiet competence began to chip away at their skepticism. The crew chief, a grizzled master sergeant named Elias, stopped seeing her as an outsider and started seeing her as a professional. "She knows the bird better than the manual does," he remarked to his team. "Acts like she built it herself." In the mess hall, she ate alone, her attention on a worn paperback or a set of technical charts. She rebuffed casual conversation not with rudeness, but with an impenetrable wall of quiet focus. The other pilots, younger and brasher, gave her a wide berth. They flew the newer, faster Apaches and Chinooks, and they saw her and her old Black Hawk as relics of a bygone era. They didn't understand her silence, mistaking it for weakness or a lack of confidence. Major Thorne observed her from a distance, his initial dismissal solidifying into a kind of grudging acceptance of her limited role. She did her job. She followed orders. She caused no problems. To him, she was a functional cog in the machine, nothing more. He was focused on Viper 3. The team had been inserted successfully and had gone silent, as planned, to maintain radio discipline. Everything was proceeding according to his plan. The first sign of trouble came not as a shout, but as a whisper. A sudden, anomalous reading from a remote weather sensor. A barometric pressure drop far faster than any model had predicted. The lead weather technician, a young Air Force lieutenant, brought the data to Thorne, his face pale. "Sir, that front Sharma mentioned, it's not just accelerating. It's hit a convergence point. The system is hyper-intensifying. We're looking at a full-blown blizzard, a whiteout with hurricane-force winds in the high peaks. It's coming in now, not tomorrow." Thorne's jaw tightened. "Get Viper 3 on the horn. I want them pulled out. Now." The comms tent buzzed with frantic energy. The reply from Viper 3 was a burst of static, then a panicked, fragmented voice. "Caught a 0-vis, rockslide, Miller's down, leg injury, evac, impossible." The signal died, swallowed by a rising shriek of atmospheric interference. The crisis had arrived. The storm fell upon the Serac peaks not like a blanket, but like an avalanche of air and ice. The world outside the tents dissolved into a screaming vortex of white. The temperature plummeted. Wind howled through the base, tearing at canvas and shrieking against metal. In the Tactical Operations Center, the mood was grim. The map showing Viper 3's last known position was a death sentence. They were in the heart of the Gorgon's Tooth, the very valley Sharma had warned about. "What's the status of the SAR birds?" Thorne demanded, his voice a low growl. The flight operations officer shook his head. "Grounded, sir. It's a 0-0 situation. The wind shear alone would tear a rotor system apart. No one can fly in this. It's suicide." Reyes, standing by the comms panel, slammed a fist against it in frustration. So we just let them die. Thorne's face was a mask of stone. He was a commander trapped by the limits of his equipment and the fury of nature. His men were out there, freezing, one of them injured, and he was helpless. The rules, the protocols, the very laws of physics told him there was nothing to be done. He hated it. He hated the helplessness more than the cold, more than the enemy. Into this tense, desperate silence, a calm voice spoke from the doorway. I can get them, sir. Every head in the TOC turned. Warrant Officer Anya Sharma stood there, her flight suit already zipped, her helmet under her arm. She looked small against the backdrop of the raging storm visible through the tent flap, but her presence filled the space. Thorne stared at her as if she were insane. Don't be ridiculous, Warrant Officer. I just heard from my chief pilot that it's impossible. You are not to even approach your aircraft. Your chief pilot flies a standard-issue Jayhawk, sir, Sharma replied, her tone even, respectful but firm. It's not rated for these conditions. The Spectre is. Reyes scoffed, stepping forward. That old wreck? It'll be ripped to pieces before it even clears the wire. You're not a SAR pilot. You're not trained for this. Sharma's eyes met Reyes's for a brief, intense moment. There was no anger in her gaze, only an unnerving certainty. She then turned her attention back to Thorne, ignoring the sergeant completely. Major, she said, stepping forward to the tactical map. The katabatic winds will be flowing down through the main valley like a river. Flying against them is impossible. But there's a sheer line on the leeward side of the western ridge. The topography creates a narrow corridor of relatively stable air, a microcushion. It won't be smooth, but it's survivable. I can ride that line in, descend through the rotor wash at the valley floor, and hover extract the team. She spoke with the cool precision of a surgeon outlining a complex procedure. She wasn't boasting. She was stating facts. The operations officer and the weather lieutenant looked at each other, then at their charts. What she was describing was a theoretical possibility, a pilot's Hail Mary that existed only in simulators and textbooks. Thorne's mind was a battlefield. His training, his protocols, his every instinct as a commander screamed at him to say no. It was an unacceptable risk. It was sending a pilot, a person he had already dismissed as barely competent, on a suicidal mission in a relic of a helicopter. But then he looked at the map, at the blinking icon representing his dying men. He looked at Sharma's face, at the absolute, unwavering confidence in her eyes. It wasn't the arrogance of a hotshot pilot. It was the deep, quiet certainty of a master of their craft. He was out of options. His men were dead if he did nothing. They were probably dead if he sent her. But her certainty offered a sliver of a chance, a ghost of hope in the heart of the storm. You're telling me you can fly into the heart of that storm, locate a four-man team in a whiteout on a mountain, and pull them out? Thorne's voice was a low growl. Yes, sir, Sharma said simply. A long, heavy silence descended on the TOC, broken only by the howl of the wind. Thorne stared at her, the fate of 5 people resting on his decision. He had dismissed her. He had underestimated her. Now she was offering the only solution, a solution that defied all logic and regulation. He made a decision not as a by-the-book officer, but as a commander desperate to save his men. Get your bird in the air, Warrant Officer, he said, his voice gravelly, and bring my men home. The order, once given, unleashed a storm of controlled chaos. While the ground crew, led by Master Sergeant Elias, rushed to prep the Spectre, Sharma moved with a deliberate, almost ritualistic calm. She didn't just supervise. She participated. She was the first one up the ladder, clearing the rapidly accumulating ice and snow from the rotor heads herself, her gloved fingers probing the composite material for any sign of stress. She spoke in low tones to Elias, pointing out specific connections and fluid levels that needed a final check. Her knowledge of the machine's unique modifications absolute. Reyes watched from a distance, his arms crossed, his skepticism warring with a growing sense of awe. He had expected panic or at least a high-strung, adrenaline-fueled rush. Instead, he saw a woman communing with her machine. He saw her place a bare hand on the cold aluminum skin of the cockpit. Just for a moment, her eyes closed. It was a gesture of respect, of partnership. "She's out of her mind," Reyes muttered to a younger soldier, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Inside the Spectre's cockpit, it was a different world. The roar of the storm was a muted, drumming presence. Sharma settled into the pilot's seat, her movements economical and precise. Her co-pilot, a young warrant officer named Chun, was visibly terrified. His face was slick with sweat despite the cold, his hands trembling slightly as he ran through the pre-flight checklist. "Warrant Officer Sharma, Anya, the windsock is gone. It just tore away," Chin stammered, his voice tight. "The tower is reporting gusts of 90 knots across the pad." Sharma didn't look at him. Her fingers danced across the instrument panel, flipping switches, adjusting dials. The cockpit lit up, a constellation of green and amber light in the dim cabin. The advanced avionics, a full-glass cockpit display that was military-grade but looked more like something from a next-generation spacecraft, hummed to life. "The windsock is irrelevant, Chan," she said, her voice a calm anchor in the turbulence of his fear. "We won't be fighting the wind. We'll be using it. Keep your eyes on the FLIR display and call out any terrain features that don't match the topographical overlay. I'll handle the rest." She engaged the turbines. The Spectre whined, then roared to life, the rotor blades beginning to turn, slowly at first, then faster, beating the thick, ice-laden air into submission. The entire airframe shuddered, straining against the gale that was trying to tear it from the ground. In the TOC, they watched the camera feed from the flight line. The helicopter was a ghost in the swirling snow, its lights barely penetrating the maelstrom. "She's actually going to do it," Thorne breathed, his eyes glued to the screen. Sharma's hands were light on the controls. The collective in her left, the cyclic in her right, her feet on the anti-torque pedals. She wasn't just flying a machine. She was connected to it. She felt the strain on the rotor mast, the bite of the wind on the tail, the subtle shifts in lift as gusts slammed into the aircraft. "Lifting," she said, her voice flat on the comms. She didn't punch up into the sky. She eased the Spectre off the ground, a delicate, controlled ascent of only a few feet, letting the machine stabilize in the ground effect. The helicopter bucked and yawed violently. Chun gasped, his knuckles white on his harness. Sharma made a series of minute, almost invisible adjustments, her body swaying with the aircraft, anticipating its every move. She was no longer a pilot in a seat. She was the central nervous system of the machine. Then, she did something that defied conventional aviation. Instead of climbing into the teeth of the storm, she pushed the nose forward and dipped low, skimming just feet above the ground, using the hangars and tents of the FOB as a windbreak to build forward momentum. Once clear of the base, she didn't ascend. She followed the contour of the terrain, flying down into a shallow ravine that led away from the base, staying below the worst of the crosswinds. "What is she doing?" Reyes yelled over the roar in the TOC. "She's flying into a box canyon." But Sharma wasn't trapped. She was navigating. On her screen, the world was a ghostly green and black image rendered by the forward-looking infrared camera, overlaid with a precise 3D topographical map from the Spectre's advanced terrain-following radar. She was flying blind, yet she could see every rock, every crevice with perfect clarity. Entering the sheer line, "Chun," she announced, her voice unchanged. "It's going to get rough." The moment they cleared the ravine and entered the main valley, the Spectre was hit by a wall of force. The aircraft dropped 100 feet in a second, slamming Chun back into his seat. Alarms shrieked through the cockpit. "Vortex ring state. We're losing lift," Chun shouted, his training taking over, his voice cracking with panic. "Negative," Sharma countered instantly, her hands a blur of motion. She pushed the cyclic forward, diving into the descent to regain airspeed, while simultaneously adjusting the collective to alter the pitch of the blades, changing the airflow dynamics around the rotor. It was an incredibly dangerous and counterintuitive maneuver. But it worked. The shuddering lessened. The alarms fell silent. The Spectre was stable again, though it was being thrown about the sky like a leaf. "I have control," she said, the words an island of calm in a sea of chaos. For 20 agonizing minutes, they flew through the maelstrom. Sharma didn't fight the turbulence. She rode it, adjusting, compensating, letting the wind guide her as much as she guided the helicopter. She was a surfer on a 100-foot wave, a master of the violent energy that surrounded her. In the TOC, they could only listen to the open comms, the howl of the wind, Chen's ragged breathing, and Sharma's steady, rhythmic voice calling out instrument readings. "Radar contact," she said suddenly. 300 meters, bearing 095. Matches the thermal signature of a collapsed rock shelter. That's them. Finding them was one thing. Getting them out was another. The valley floor was a maelstrom of swirling snow and vicious rotor wash from the cliff faces. A stable hover was impossible. "Chun, get the hoist ready. Talk to them. Tell them I can only give them one pass," she commanded. "I'm going to put the bird into a controlled drift hover. We'll have maybe 30 seconds of relative stability. They need to be ready to hook up and go." She brought the Spectre around, positioning it upwind of the stranded team. Then, she began a slow, deliberate descent, crabbing the helicopter sideways against the wind, her eyes scanning between the infrared display and the slivers of the real world visible through the snow-blasted cockpit window. The helicopter groaned in protest, the engines screaming as she demanded maximum power, then minimum, in a constant, fluid dance. On the ground, the men of Viper 3 heard it first. A low, guttural thumping that seemed to come from the storm itself. They looked up to see a single, ghostly light descending through the white hell. It wasn't a stable platform. It was a bucking, swaying beast, but it was there. The hoist line snaked down, whipping wildly in the wind. "Go! Go now!" their team leader yelled. They clipped the injured soldier, Miller, to the line first. The moment his weight was on the hoist, the Spectre dipped violently. In the cockpit, Sharma's muscles burned as she fought the controls, her feet feathering the pedals to keep the tail from whipping around into the cliff face. "He's on! Bring him up!" Chun yelled into his mic. One by one, they were pulled from the frozen hell of the mountain. The last man clipped himself on just as a massive gust slammed into the Spectre, pushing it dangerously close to the rocks. Sharma felt the skid scrape stone. Without hesitation, she redlined the engines, pulling the aircraft up and away, dragging the last soldier through the air as the hoist frantically reeled him in. The flight back was just as harrowing, but inside the Spectre, there was a new sound, the ragged, relieved breathing of the rescued men. Sharma's focus never wavered. She navigated the treacherous currents, her body and mind fused with the machine, until the dim lights of FOB Serenity appeared through the swirling snow. She didn't land. She hovered over the medical bay, lowering the soldiers directly to the waiting medics before finally bringing the Spectre back to its pad. The landing was so gentle it felt as if the storm had simply released them. As the turbines spooled down, a profound silence filled the cockpit. Chun was slumped in his seat, utterly spent, his face a mask of disbelief and awe. Sharma simply sat for a moment, her hands resting lightly on the controls, her breathing slow and even. She had done the impossible. She had flown into the heart of a killer storm and brought everyone home. In the immediate aftermath, the focus was on the rescued soldiers of Viper 3. They were rushed into the medical tent, suffering from severe hypothermia and frostbite, but alive. Miller, the injured man, had a compound fracture but was stable. The medics worked feverishly, the tension of the last hour slowly giving way to the focused calm of their work. Major Thorne was there, overseeing everything, his face grim but etched with a profound relief. As the initial chaos subsided, a different kind of awareness began to settle over the base. People started talking about the flight. The operations officer replayed the sensor data from Sharma's helicopter, his expression one of pure disbelief. The G-forces she was pulling, the constant, near-critical adjustments. "It's not humanly possible," he murmured to a colleague. The system logs show she was manually overriding the flight stabilization computer for most of the approach. She was flying on pure instinct. Corporal Davies, a young comms technician who had been monitoring the flight, was staring at a freeze frame from the landing pad camera. It showed Sharma stepping out of the cockpit. A strap on her flight suit had shifted during the turbulent flight, revealing a small, faded patch that was normally hidden. It wasn't a standard unit insignia. It was a dark, stylized rendering of a screaming woman's face with wild, flowing hair, set against a backdrop of a rotor blade. It was subtle, easily missed, but for those who knew the rumors, the ghost stories that special operators told around fires, it was unmistakable. "Sir," Davies said, his voice barely a whisper. "You need to see this," he pointed to the screen. At the same time, inside his private office, Major Thorne was doing his own research. The quiet warrant officer's impossible feat had broken through his rigid, procedural worldview. He had pulled up her personnel file on his secure terminal. Most of it was standard, enlistment date, basic training, flight school. But the section detailing her service history was a wall of black redactions. Unit assignments were classified. Mission logs were classified. For 15 years, Anya Sharma had, on paper, ceased to exist. Then he saw a single, unredacted entry under special qualifications. It read, High Altitude / Extreme Weather Insertion Specialist, Tier 1 EWO. Below it was a list of advanced training courses that Thorne had only ever heard of in hushed tones. Courses designed to create pilots who could operate far beyond the known limits of their aircraft and their own endurance. His eyes scanned down until he found it. A single, unredacted call sign from a previous, highly classified attachment. Banshee. The name hit Thorne like a physical blow. Banshee. It wasn't just a call sign. It was a legend. A ghost story whispered from the Hindu Kush to the Andes. A pilot who could fly in weather that grounded gods. A name associated with the most daring, most impossible Black Ops insertions and extractions of the last decade. They said Banshee flew a specially modified Black Hawk, a Spectre, so advanced it was practically a prototype. They said Banshee could land on a dime in a hurricane, that she could navigate by the stars in a total systems failure. Thorne had always assumed it was an exaggeration, a boogeyman invented to scare rookie pilots. He never imagined Banshee was a quiet, unassuming woman in her late 40s who he had tasked with flying MREs. He looked up from his screen, the silence of his office profound. He thought of her calm voice in the briefing, warning him about the storm. He thought of her standing in the doorway of the TOC, her quiet, absolute certainty. He thought of his own dismissive, condescending words. "You're not trained for this." The memory of it burned with shame. He hadn't just been wrong. He had been spectacularly, dangerously ignorant. He had mistaken mastery for mediocrity. He had looked at a finely honed weapon and seen only a dull tool. The next morning, the storm had broken. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue, and the newly fallen snow on the Serac peaks glittered in the sharp sunlight. The air was still and cold. The base was slowly returning to life, the sound of shovels and generators replacing the howl of the wind. When Anya Sharma entered the mess tent for coffee, the usual morning chatter died away. It didn't stop abruptly. It just faded, like a radio dial being slowly turned down. Every eye was on her. The young pilots who had privately mocked her now stared at their trays, unable to meet her gaze. The NCOs who had seen her as an oddity now watched with a new, profound respect. Sergeant Reyes was sitting at a table near the door. He saw her enter, and for a moment he froze. Then, he did something that stunned everyone who knew him. He stood up, picked up his half-full coffee mug and tray, and moved to another, more crowded table. He didn't say a word. He just cleared the space for her, a silent public admission of his error. It was a gesture of deference, an apology offered in the only language that mattered in this place. Sharma gave a slight nod in his direction and poured herself a coffee, her expression as unreadable as ever. She took the offered seat, the space around her a silent bubble of newfound reverence. Later that day, As she was beginning her post-flight inspection of the Spectre, Major Thorne approached her. He didn't summon her to his office. He came to her place of work, the hangar where she and her machine rested. He stopped a few feet away, his hands clasped behind his back. The arrogance and condescension were gone, replaced by a formal, almost stiff humility. "Warrant Officer Sharma," he began, his voice quiet but clear. He used her full rank and name, a formality he hadn't bothered with before. "I've reviewed the flight data from your sortie last night. I've also reviewed your service record. The parts that I am cleared to see, at least." Sharma paused in her work, wiping a smear of grease from her knuckles with a rag. She simply waited, her gaze steady. Thorne took a breath. An apology from a man like him was a rare and difficult thing. "Your warning about the weather was correct. My assessment of your capabilities was not. Your performance was exemplary. You saved the lives of 5 of my men." He paused, searching for the right words. "What you did was something I have never seen before, and I doubt I will ever see again." He looked from her to the Spectre, then back again. He finally seemed to understand that the two were a single entity, a pilot and a machine perfectly in sync. "Thank you for your service, Warrant Officer," he said, and then he rendered a slow, perfect salute. It wasn't the perfunctory gesture of a superior to a subordinate. It was the crisp, unwavering salute of one warrior acknowledging another. Sharma held his gaze for a moment, then returned the salute with equal precision. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The gesture said everything. As Thorne turned and walked away, the leader of Viper 3, his arm in a sling and his face etched with exhaustion and gratitude, approached her. He didn't salute. He just stood before her and said, "We heard stories about a pilot called Banshee. We thought they were just stories." He shook his head slowly. "Thank you for not being a story." He too then left her alone. The sun began to dip below the western peaks, painting the snow-covered mountains in hues of orange and purple. The day was ending. The base was settling into its evening rhythm. The crisis passed, the dead safely averted. Anya Sharma was alone in the cavernous hangar with the Spectre. The lights cast long shadows, and the air was cold and smelled of hydraulic fluid and jet fuel. For her, it was the smell of home. She didn't leave. Her work wasn't finished. The flight had pushed the machine to its absolute limits, and it deserved her attention. She moved around the helicopter with a quiet, methodical grace, her hands running over its surfaces, checking for stress fractures, for loose rivets, for the slightest sign of damage. She wasn't just a pilot performing a post-flight check. She was a caregiver tending to a partner who had carried her through a trial by fire. She climbed into the silent cockpit. The screens were dark, the instruments cold. The only light was the fading alpenglow filtering through the hangar doors. She ran a hand over the cyclic, the cool metal familiar and reassuring beneath her calloused fingers. She remembered the violent shuddering, the shriek of the alarms, the feeling of the airframe screaming in protest. And she remembered the perfect, fluid response of the machine to her every command, the way it had held together when by all rights it should have been torn apart. She didn't think about Thorne's apology or Reyes's deference or the awe in the eyes of the men she had rescued. Those things were external, fleeting. They were the consequences of her actions, not the reason for them. Her reality was here in this seat with this machine. The bond between them was forged in pressure and turbulence, a silent understanding that existed beyond rank, beyond reputation, beyond words. Outside, the first stars began to appear in the deep indigo sky. The wind had died completely, leaving behind a profound, crystalline silence. FOB Serenity was a small island of light and life in a vast, indifferent wilderness of rock and ice. From his office window, Major Thorne could see the single light on in the hangar. He watched the small, solitary figure moving around the helicopter, a silhouette of quiet, relentless competence. He knew he was witnessing something few commanders ever got to see. Not just a good pilot, but a master, a legend in her own time. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would never underestimate a quiet woman in a faded flight suit ever again. Anya Sharma finished her checks. Every system was green. Every component was secure. The Spectre was ready. She leaned back in her seat and watched the constellations wheel slowly across the sky through the cockpit's armored glass. She wasn't waiting for new orders or for the dawn. She was simply being. Here, in the quiet heart of her storm-tested machine, under the silent watch of the mountains, she was exactly where she belonged.